All right, starting with Section 1, Planting Seeds of Civilization, the agricultural spark that changed everything.
To put all this into perspective, think about this. Around 3 billion years ago, we were literally just tiny atoms floating around in the world's petri dish. Fast forward to 6 million years ago, we get the first hominids. By 400,000 years ago, Neanderthals appear. But the absolute explosion of human dominance, the real spark, happened around 4000 BCE. Down in Mesopotamian cities like Uruk, humans stopped just wandering, hunting, and gathering. We invented the hand mill to crush harvested wheat and barley. We figured out how to create our own food source. Basically, we went from a floating speck in the universe to a settled species.
But, there was a massive cost to this progress. Agriculture was, without a doubt, a total miracle. It allowed cities like Uruk to boom to something like 50,000 residents. But we actually traded our physical health for it. We went from being these agile, nomadic hunter-gatherers with an average male height of 5'9" to living an incredibly grueling, landlocked farming life where, get this, the average male height literally shrank to 5'3". Crazy, right? Moving right along to Section 2, Writing Rules for Society, moving from survival to social order. So as these agricultural cities grew massively, humanity desperately needed rules, mostly just to avoid total chaos. And this brilliantly illustrates how we solved it. Whether you look at ancient Egypt, the Zhou dynasty in China, or feudal Europe centuries later, these are completely isolated civilizations, yet the exact same social pyramid emerged over and over. You've got a supreme ruler at the top, a middle class of nobles or soldiers, and then the massive, crushing weight of society resting squarely on the peasants and slaves at the bottom producing the food.
Now, to enforce these wildly unequal pyramids, early legal systems had to be created. You've probably heard of King Hammurabi's famous stone slab of laws. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. It sounds fair on the surface, right? But the crucial thing to understand here is that this was absolutely not about equality. Hammurabi's code strictly enforced that social pyramid. Under the law, the value of a noble's eye or bone was worth far more than a commoner's, which was worth more than a slave's. Human life had strict, unequal price tags.
Which leads us to a really provocative question. Why on earth would the vast majority of humanity just settle for a life of grueling farming at the very bottom of this pyramid, day in, day out? Well, part of it was sheer necessity. It takes a massive amount of labor to feed an empire. And part of it was just straight-up fear of unprotected violence. But to survive, they also desperately needed a psychological coping mechanism. Enter philosophy and religion. These systems of thought became the ultimate tools to provide meaning to the masses. Think about it. When your entire life consists of heavy taxation and backbreaking labor, you need a psychological safety net to make that existence bearable and to keep society humming along. We actually see this perfectly contrasted in ancient China. To survive their really difficult lives, people turned to two main frameworks. Confucianism taught folks to embrace their social duty and maintain strict hierarchy. It was all about rituals and manners to keep order. But on the flip side, Taoism offered a totally different coping mechanism. It focused on detaching from external control, finding inner peace, and just aligning with the natural flow of the universe, balancing yin and yang. Meanwhile, over in Greece, they were experimenting with entirely different ways to organize government, literally side by side. Athens developed this chaotic democracy where leaders for the Council of 500 were randomly selected using this crazy machine called the Clariterion. Right next door, Sparta built this severe, aristocratic, militaristic society where every single aspect of life, right from birth, was brutally dedicated to physical strength and war. All right, Section 3, the Age of Empires, the era of brutal expansion and connected worlds. So the world was filling up, and civilizations grew incredibly hungry for land. But how do massive empires justify having absolute power? And more importantly, how do they explain it when they inevitably collapse? So the crucial point is perfectly summarized by the Chinese Zhou dynasty's Mandate of Heaven. It said, heaven grants the right to rule, but only based on virtue. If an emperor becomes corrupt or a massive natural disaster strikes, heaven just revokes the mandate and a new dynasty takes over. It's this built-in explanation for an endless cycle of rising and falling empires. And speaking of rising empires, nobody rose faster than Alexander the Great. But what made his conquests so unique wasn't just his military might, it was his mind. He was actually tutored by Aristotle, the guy who literally fathered logic and the scientific method. So as Alexander conquered the known world, he was simultaneously planting the seeds of Greek ideals, logic, and philosophy throughout his vast, albeit pretty short-lived empire. Then, of course, we have the dramatic, epic narrative arc of Rome. Founded way back in 753 BCE by the legendary Romulus and Remus, it grew into this massive republic right up until Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. That sparked a massive civil war, and Caesar was eventually assassinated in 44 BCE. That paved the way for Augustus to step in as the first emperor. But eventually, exactly like the mandate of heaven predicts, the empire simply collapsed under its own massive, unmanageable weight in 476 AD. Now, we absolutely cannot talk about empires without talking about the Mongols. To put their impact into perspective, today, an astonishing 8% of all men in modern South Asia are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. Let that sink in. That is a staggering genetic footprint, and it perfectly highlights the terrifying, brutal, and massive reach of the Mongol Empire across the globe. Let's move to and see how this builds into Section 4, Revolutions, Rebirths, and Rights. Emerging from dark ages into a new dawn. Interestingly enough, it took a massive tragedy to spark this new era. Between 75 and 200 million people died from the bubonic plague, which spread like wildfire across the exact same trade routes that connected those great empires we just talked about. It was a horrific cost of progress, but ironically, because so many laborers died, the surviving peasants suddenly had real leverage. Landowners were quite literally forced to give them better wages and more rights just to keep the farms running. We actually see this massive shift in the balance of power formalized in 1215. English barons got together and forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. For the very first time, we're seeing the demand for individual liberties, the right to a fair trial, and this incredibly groundbreaking idea that absolutely no ruler is above the law. That absolute power at the top of the pyramid, it was finally being challenged. And this questioning of the old pyramids absolutely exploded during the Renaissance. It's like a three-step process. Step 1, artistic mastery. Think Da Vinci and Michelangelo. They started focusing deeply on human emotion and human potential, not just deities. Step 2, political realism. Machiavelli writes The Prince and literally pulls back the curtain on how leaders use fear to maintain power. And step 3, religious reformation. Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door, successfully challenging the absolute, unquestioned authority of the Catholic Church.
Which brings our epic 6-million-year timeline to a brilliant crescendo. In 1776, the American Declaration of Independence boldly declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." I mean, just think about how far we've come. We evolved from Hammurabi's brutal stone laws, where a noble was legally worth more than a slave, to this radical, world-changing assertion of universal human equality. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. We've spent this explainer looking at how human history is basically an endless cycle. We build these massive hierarchical pyramids, we tear them down, and we gradually demand more rights. So I have to ask you, based on this grand cycle, what kind of civilization are we building today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this leaves you incredibly curious to dig in and learn more.